Hello again. So I realise it's been absolutely ages since I've given a tutorial on anything, and when I first started this channel my intention was to try and do tutorials, not with the intention of like I'm a camera genius and I know exactly what to do, but more from a perspective of these are some of the things that I've picked up along the way, they're what I find really useful and helpful, and I can give those to you. You can use them, you can have them as good ideas, or you can just throw them in the bin and think I'm completely and utterly crazy, which is understandable. So since it's been a while, we're going to kick off with what I think is one of the most used features by myself in Lightroom. Bearing in mind that I do use Lightroom Classic, so if you are using Lightroom CC, you do have all of these options, but they might be in a slightly different place. So the feature that I'm talking about is the masking tool. It's a really important tool for trying to block out light in your images, make sure you get the correct exposure in the right places, and basically just do some cool stuff, which is what I use it for. So let's go have a play. So I think the best thing I can do is go from top to bottom in terms of the masks, and bearing in mind this is the latest version of Lightroom, so there's a bit of an overhaul in how masks work inside Lightroom Classic, for the better, because it does give you a lot more options, but it also makes them, in my opinion, slightly more complicated. But the benefits you do get out of them is good. So the very first one we've got is being able to select a subject. So you can see here I've got a picture of a robin, and if I just want to go and select it and do something only to that robin, simply make sure you've got the masking option selected, select subject, and it will detect that subject. Sometimes it's not too great, sometimes it is. So you can see that down here it's missed part of the belly a bit, whether it thinks that's part of the background, who knows, but the good thing is it's selected most of it. Now there are ways we can bring more of that in focus, which we'll go into later. But the important thing is it's a really good way to quickly select something and be able to edit it. So this is a good point to explain a little bit about the mask and overlay. When you start adding masks, you'll see that you've got this option in the top. What we've got is our mask, and then we've got the type of mask. So just think of this as a layer, and we can have multiple masks underneath. So we want to put one in at the moment, which is a subject selection. And I can add and subtract to that. What that means is I can add more masks to that. So for example, I can click in and I can choose to add a brush mask on top of this. That's good and useful because it means that I can now, very badly, but we'll see how we go, fill in those little bits that have been missed. Now you'll see I've got the flow quite low here, but if we bring that up a touch, you can see that belly is now becoming red. Now I'm not making it the red colour, but that's because I've got an overlay selected. You can change the colour of your overlay to anything you want. Personally, I leave it at the default red so it's obvious what it is. Then that option can be turned on and off. As soon as you start changing any of the effects on that mask, the overlay will remove and show you the image underneath. So as soon as I take exposure, you can see that is only affecting the exposure of the selected mask and that robin. Simple, I'm sure, but incredibly useful. So it's very important to note that the masks underneath are additive, and they are all affected by the same effects. If I wanted to add another mask that was separate from this, so let's, for example, and we're going to go quite wild here. So my robin, I want to be really bright, and I'm going to decide I want to add another mask. So I'm going to take a linear gradient, drag it across, and reduce that exposure. So the exposure of the robin, which has been increased, is separate from the exposure of the linear gradient. You can easily flick between these two and go back to your brush and your subject and bring that down again independently of the gradient. So as long as you've got the right one selected, you can always go back and edit it. And you'll see you get different toggles on the screen, so you can choose the different ones and the types that they are. So to go on to the next one, we're going to flick over to this image. Just an average image, nice landscape, nice sky. Now I don't use this one as much, I still prefer to use linear gradients for this, but it's good to know that it's available and to try it. So we have a select sky mask. Once again, we have the masking selected, and this is the second one down. As soon as we select that, it's going to have a think, and hopefully detect our sky. And we add a mask and a layer in exactly the same way. Once again, as soon as you change that exposure, that will get rid of the overlay and show you where that exposure is. And you can always bring it back by clicking the button again. Another thing to be aware of while we're here is intersections. And this is where I said it gets quite complicated. So if I have a mask, I can intersect that mask with another one. So I might decide I want to have a linear gradient. As that linear gradient comes across, you'll notice that it is only affecting this top right. It has not affected the ground, and that's because this mask is intersecting with the original sky mask. So now I'm only affecting that top right quadrant of the sky. So for me, this means if I wanted to, I could brighten just this portion of the sky. I wouldn't be affecting anything outside that gradient. Pretty cool. So, moving back to our robin. I'm just going to reset this just so we can continue. You saw the brush earlier in terms of filling in the belly, but the brush is very good for fine-tuning things. Let's say, for example, that I wanted to pick out more detail in the back of this bird from the light. A very favourite technique of mine is take the exposure, increase it all the way, not to 40, but to 4, which is the maximum generally. Take the flow right down, maybe to about 4 or 5 in this area. Bring that size up a little bit. And then we're just going to draw quite quickly. And as you see, the more that I go over, the lighter that's going to get. I find this technique just useful for giving a little bit more detail to areas that you think the light might drop. And once again, if you go too far, you can always decrease that again. But the other thing, you can erase the brush. So you can see, take that straight out again. I don't want to do that red breast, but I do want to continue doing the back of the bird. Okay. Next one down, linear gradient, which is quite, yeah, definitely my most used one. And I use it quite heavily for adding a lot more darkness to images, because I do like moody, dark images going through, and I guess it's a bit more focused than a vignette, but also I can block light, so rather than doing the radial, which we'll get into in a minute, I can be a bit more selective with areas coming in. What the gradient has probably more historically been used for is similar to a gradient ND filter on top of the camera. So for example, back to our sky, you'll probably find a gradient applied in a similar fashion to this, straight down, blocking out sky and bringing down the exposure. Simples. The next one on our list, do it from up here and add it on, is a radial gradient. So clicking and dragging will create a circle initially, or ellipse, and we have a couple of controls we can do on that. The important thing is on the outside we can rotate the entire shape. The inner circle is how much we're going to feather that gradient. So I'll show you what that means. If I change my exposure quite bright over all of this, you can see that's just created a giant overexposed circle. Whereas if I take that feather and move it back inside, I'm coming from the centre of there and starting to feather out as we get closer to this edge. And that can help us soften that a little bit and just be a little bit less harsh. The next one on our list is the colour range. So as you can see, it says click anywhere to sample colours. To remove areas, create a subtract tool. So the first thing we do after we select this mask is we get a dropper tool. So if I want to select the orange of the bird, you can see we have our colour range selected at the top here. As I change the exposure, I'm changing the colour range of that. Some of the seeds are picked up as well. Refining will bring things in and out of that range. So if I reduce that to 1, it will be very dead set on this top area where I originally selected. Whereas if I take that all the way up to 100, you can actually start to see that some of the brown and the wingtips of the bird have been affected. This is very good if you've got a lot of colour of a particular type in an image that you want to change. Finally, onto the luminance mask. So this is similar to the colour range, but we're doing it more based on luminance. So from the overlay, you can see that the lighter colours are selected. As we move that luminance, we can bring it closer to the luminance that we selected, which is in the middle here. And that's similar to the colour range in that we can change the range of how much we select within that and how much fall off there is. It's not a tool that I use a lot of, but that's given the type of images that I like to create. So I would say play around, see if it's useful to you, and see how you go. Now you'll notice that you have a depth range on your option, and that's generally going to be greyed out unless you take a lot of mobile phone photography. With some of the newer cameras, I believe, coming out for mobile phones, and I'm happy to stand corrected on this one, they have multiple cameras, and those multiple cameras can change the range or depth of an image to kind of give an artificial focal length to a certain degree. So if you take an image with a mobile device in the Lightroom app, then depth range will be enabled. It's something I've never seen enabled because I barely use the app. But if you do it, and you are using Lightroom CC a lot, that's good to know. So that's it. I hope you've learned a little bit more about masks. If they're useful, let me know. If you've enjoyed this, subscribe, and until next time, see you later on.